To students of poetry, I say, here I am for whom you've been waiting. I'm going to speak today about poetics, what makes for poems as high art, and how those poems are written. My name is Robert King, and I'm going to speak today about poetics. For more than a quarter century, I studied poetry and poetics in New York City with a master poet and teacher, Jose Garcia Villa. Villa is not well known today, but in the mid-20th century, he was a striking figure in American poetry and literary circles. Briefly, I'm going to introduce Villa, I'm going to introduce his theory of poetry, and then I'm going to refer you to my website where you may learn more. But first, I'd like you to focus on this picture. It was taken in November 1948 in New York City at an occasion to celebrate the visit to the United States of a distinguished English poet, Dame Edith Sitwell, and her brother Osbert. The guests included some of the most important poets, writers, and critics of that time. The poets included W.H. Auden, Elizabeth Bishop, Marianne Moore, Delmore Schwartz, Randall Jarrell, Stephen Spender, and Richard Eberhart. Other literary notables included Tennessee Williams and Gore Vidal. Tucked between Vidal and Auden is a less familiar figure, 40-year-old Filipino-born poet Jose Garcia Villa, perhaps most striking for being the only non-Caucasian in this distinguished group. In 1942, Villa published his first book of poems entitled Have Come, Am Here. The book met with immediate critical success and won for Villa wide acclaim. As the picture illustrates, it also gained him admission to the highest of American literary circles. Villa was born in 1908, came to the U.S. in 1930, and was initially a successful short story writer. However, in the 1930s, inspired by the poems of, among others, E.E. Cummings and Gerard Manley Hopkins, by the brilliance and genius of Walt Whitman, and by the craftsmanship of Marianne Moore, Villa turned to writing poems. Close study of their poems first informed Villa's vision of what makes for poems as high art. And from the 1950s until his death in 1997, Villa developed and honed his theory of poetry, recorded it in lecture notes and other important papers, and used them to teach poetry workshops at New York City College, at the New School for Social Research, and at his apartment in Greenwich Village. Villa intended to turn his theory of poetry into a book. Two more pictures of Villa, this one taken in 1942 at the time of the publication of his Have Come, Am Here, and this one taken approximately 40 years later of a much older Villa and a much younger me having a discussion at a poetry workshop at his apartment. Villa had intended to turn his theory of poetry into book form, but health and energy failed him, and after his death and after my own retirement, I turned to the task. Villa's papers were donated by his estate to the Houghton Library Collection at Harvard University. From those sources, from my own notes and recollections of Villa's workshops, and from those of other Villa students, I turned his teachings into a book that has the title simply, Poetry Is. Villa is truly the author of that book, although I wrote the manuscript because I took great care to faithfully record not only his concepts, but his own words in the manuscript. The book teaches its readers what is true poetry, what poems can and cannot do, how poetry differs from prose, the other literary art, and how true poems are written. The book also teaches the reader that what passes for poetry these days is not high art, is not even art, is not poetry, and is not even verse. It is prose, pure and simple. Granted, prose chopped up into uneven and unbalanced lines to mimic verse, but prose nevertheless. Villa described it as follows, quote, "With notable exceptions, practically every line I read in today's poetry is a mishap in language as well as a mishap in craft." It reminds me of what Time magazine described as unmemorable, flathead verse, an unnecessary and misguided burden upon the ear and upon the imagination. In the 1980s, Villa edited a poetry magazine, Bravo. What you see here is the back cover of an issue of that magazine. On that back cover, Villa listed 3 basic and fundamental principles that represent the essence of his theory of poetry. He said, poetry must have formal excellence. Poetry must be lyrical. Poetry is not prose. By formal excellence, I should explain, Villa was not referring to what is known as formalism in poetry, which embraces rigid attention to metrics, strict adherence to fixed and arbitrary forms such as the sonnet or the sestina, use of imagery, and insistence upon rhyming patterns. Rather, Villa's theory of modern poetry embraces basic and fundamental principles that inform the poet as to how to write lyrical poems as high art. And they are principles, not rules, made to be infringed upon so long as the poet understands and is faithful to the overriding principle that a work of art is not what it is about, but what it is. In poetry, it's qualities of writing. This is what makes us experience the art. When Villa used the term lyrical, he used it to denote the elements of song or musicality, the magic of poetic language, and the spirits of play and of grace that the poet invests in his work. A miracle occurs when the lyrical spirit enters the work. It is no longer flat, no longer at street level. It takes to the air and it gives both the poem and the reader a lift. Pegasus is the mythical winged horse that flies rather than treads along the ground. Today's poetry does not provide that lift. It thuds, and it is off-putting, and it will be scoffed at by future generations. When Villa said that poetry is not prose, he correctly identified the greatest threat to poetry as art that exists today, because of the widespread confusion between what is prose and what is poetry. Today's poets believe that prose is poetry, with the consequence that they use the ordinary and everyday language of common speech as the language for poems, and they believe that poems are successful so long as they communicate a planned message. In contrast, Villa's theory of true poetry holds that the poet must use heightened and sensory language to evoke a message that even the poet does not recognize as his own because it springs from his subconscious. Now to my website. The link is www.theoryofpoetry.com. Among other things, the website has a contact page whereby you can provide feedback to me, and if you do, then I can provide notification to you when this manuscript is published. Thank you for your attention.